Had been said, I will give a talk today about the arc narrative, which is usually to be found in 1 Samuel 4-6 and 2 Samuel 6. So as this conference workshop is all about the direction, we are very happy to see it within the arc narrative. The arc narrative is basically a travel narrative. And because the whole story starts in 1 Samuel 4 with the ark brought from Shiloh to the battlefield at Ebenezer, and after 2 lost battles against the Philistines take the ark and bring them to Ashdod, then to Gad, Ekron, Bet Shemesh in Kiryat Yearim. So this is the first section of the narrative, ends in 1 Samuel 6. And then in 2 Samuel 6 the ark is brought to Jerusalem. So, and in terms of directions, I see 2 direction lines within the narrative here. It's one movement from the north, from Shiloh to the south Jerusalem, and some may say from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom. And we have also another movement going the ark from the west, from the coastal plain, from Ashdod, the first place where the ark is brought to Jerusalem. And in what follows, I will focus on this west-east direction of the ark narrative. And I will want to show what interpretation this west-east movement within this story could be, and why the Philistines function as the prime enemies within this arc narrative. And I do have a script, so I will sit down now and we will see how this plays out. I will give a very short overview on the research first. And we see here that the idea that the ark finally reaches Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6 was believed to be the decisive point of the whole narrative. Since Leonard Rost, the publication you can see here, these chapters in 1 and 1st and 2nd Samuel have been identified as an original independent story. He called it the ark narrative, as a hieros logos, a cultic legend written by a priest of the 10th century BCE in order to explain to pilgrims visiting the ark shrine in Jerusalem how the ark eventually arrived here in Jerusalem. So this was all the idea of Leonard Rost. And while the main idea of a separate narrative to be found in 1 Samuel 4-6 and 2 Samuel 6, within the larger framework of the compilation of the book of Samuel, survived for quite a long time. And this is also thanks to Martin Noth, who took over the idea of Leonard Rost in his Überlieferungsgeschichtliche Studien. In modern research, Rost's theory is rejected, or at least heavily modified by most modern scholars for several reasons. There's no time in this paper to deal with the whole discussion here, and I refer to this study from Einickel. There are not many publications after this Einickel paper, so you get a very good impression of the discussion here. 2 aspects of the current debate I want to highlight here. First, the question of unity of 1 Samuel 4-6, and on the other hand 2 Samuel 6, which plays in Jerusalem, which was proposed. This unity was questioned until the 1990s, and now usually 2 separate and independent narratives are assumed. So basically we have the idea is that we have a northern ark narrative to be found in 1 Samuel 4-6, and we have a southern Judean or Judahite ark narrative to be found in 2 Samuel 6 in Jerusalem. Both stories would then have been fairly late within the literary growth of the books of Samuel connected. And within these theses, the first ark narrative, 1 Samuel 5 and 6, the last mentioned travel point here, I can show it again on the map, is Kiryat Yearim. And this would, by most interpreters, be seen so the narrative would be seen as a sort of legitimation of this place called Kiryat Yerim. And this has recently been again proposed by Israel Finkelstein and Thomas Römer, which you can see here, and which is connected to their excavation, their recent excavation at Kiryat Yerim itself. Römer and Finkelstein linked the finding of an elevated platform there, which can be dated apparently to Iron Age II, with the idea that under Jeroboam II the platform was to accommodate an Israelite administration compound, including a temple which possibly contained the Ark. So this is the idea of Finkelstein and Römer. In their view, the Ark narrative in 1 Samuel 4-7 legitimizes the building of this new sanctuary in order to provide a new home for the formerly destroyed Shiloh sanctuary, where the Ark used to have been placed before. And as you can see in this research context, we do not have any west-east movement more within the narrative. It's just simply the Ark going down from Shiloh and how does it end up in Kiryat Yearim, but the research does not focus on this west-east movement. The major objection I have with these arguments from Finkelstein and Römer is that Kiryat Yearim, at least within the biblical context, is a Judean settlement, or at least a settlement on the Judean border region, and not one that is clearly, as Finkelstein states, attributed to the northern kingdom. The same is true, by the way, for Bet Shemesh, which is a station, a waypoint just mentioned before Kiryat Yearim, which is also can be attributed, if not to Philistine territory, it's attributed to in the northern Shevelah, as we heard yesterday. It can be attributed to the Judean territory. So already in the first part of this narrative, we have a strong, I think, Judean perspective in this text. The second remark on research is, of course, the question of historical context of the Ark narratives. This is where scholars are divided basically into two camps. Those belonging to the first see the Ark narrative as a historical account and assign it to an early phase of the history of Israel, namely to the 10th or 9th century. And I give you a quote here by Ahlström, but I could have chosen many other quotes, it's just as an example. And for a recent example of this idea that the main purpose is to show how Jerusalem and the Yahwistic belief became prominent in Jerusalem is supported by the Ark narrative. It's also by the last commentary published. Now, Walter Dietrich, in his lastly published commentary in 2019, had this same idea that the 10th, 9th century, the whole Ark narrative has been written and supports the idea of Jerusalem being the new Israelite center. There are scholars from the other camp that assign the story, and this is a little bit what Manfred Oeming hinted at the beginning from his speech. They assign the whole story to the exilic or post-exilic Persian period, and look for a religious and historical lesson in it. According to this view, the capture of the Ark by the Philistines is an allusion to the pillage of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians. The story was meant to give hope to the exiles that Adonai will overcome his captors, will defeat the Babylonians, and will bring back the temple vessels, and will help rebuild the temple as he did in the early days. So research along this line is connected with the names of John van Ziethes, Klaas Melik, Peter Potzik, and Reinhard Katz from Göttingen. The central question for me would be here on these theories: why the Philistines of all people are being used as a, let's say, literary template, a foil for an alleged story of Judean exiles and the Babylonians. So in my paper, as you can see here, will be shaped by three parts, and as you can guess from the headers from the sections, I will explore a certain cultural, historical, and religious historical background of the travel narrative of the Ark in 1 Samuel 5 and 6 that has not been done before yet, or at least not to that extent and consequences, but which I think is defining for the purpose of the narrative and will give the discussion maybe a new spin. This is the practice of God-nabbing, the deportation of cult statues, which is well testified in, for example, Assyrian sources. So, without further ado, we jump into the first section, into the biblical text. In 1 Samuel 4, this chapter sets the stage for the travels of the Ark through Philistine territory. After 2 lost battles against the Philistines, the Ark is taken from Israel, verse 11. And if that wasn't enough, also the priestly family of the Elites, which had to guard the Ark in Shiloh, died in the consequences of these battles. The last incident this chapter notes is that Eli's daughter-in-law gave birth to a son, and she dies under childbirth, but still manages to give him a meaningful name, and he called him Ichabod, which can be translated as "Where is the Kavod Adonai of Israel?" Or as Walter Brüggemann, I think, fittingly translated the name, "God is gone." Ichabod, where is the Kavod? God is gone. This is the last name, the last section of this narrative. And with this impression, God is gone, the following narrative focuses entirely the chapters 5 and 6 and 7 verse 1 on the fate of the Ark. Without its people, no Israelites are mentioned there, and without the priesthood, because the Elites are gone. Yet, despite these unpromising conditions, the Philistines seem to have no control of the Ark. And the first episode on enemy territory, which you can see here, is brought to Ashdod and presented to the temple of its god Dagon in 1 Samuel 5, 1-8. In the following, the Ark brings to fall the statue of Dagon in a mysterious way. And the deadly disease spreads amongst the people of Ashdod. Because of these incidents, the Ark is directly sent to Gath and then to Ekron, where comparable incidents happen. So this is basically what happened in 1 Samuel 5. And in the end, the entire Philistine pentapolis must give in to the power of the Ark. And to avoid further incidents, religious specialists are asked for advice, 1 Samuel 6 verse 2. And in the course of these events, the Ark ventures back to homeland, to be more specific, back to Judahite homeland, first to Bet-Shemesh and then eventually to Kiryat Yearim. This concludes the section of the Ark, the first part of the Ark narrative. The Ark plays no role, and this is important, the Ark plays no role anymore in the subsequent Samuel Saul narrative. And the first time we hear again about the Ark is in 2 Samuel 6, when the Ark is transferred to Jerusalem. And I'm going here with the classical view that the original narrative ends in 2 Samuel 6. So there is a connection between 1 Samuel 4-6 and 2 Samuel 6, basically because both parts of the narrative already have this Judahite or Judean perspective. This will become clearer in a minute. We will move on to what I think is the cultural, or one cultural and religious historical background of the narrative. Research regularly notes, especially since the study you can see here by Patrick Miller and Jack Roberts, The Hand of Adonai, the Lord, that there are certain ancient Near Eastern parallels reflected in the Ark narrative, namely, on the one hand, the custom that spoils of war and in particular cult inventory are displayed in the temple of the deity of the victorious nation. like the ark being placed in the temple of Dagon in 1 Samuel 5. For example, the Mesha stele mentions various victories of the Moabite king Mesha over the Israel settlements, and in one instance the inscription mentions cult objects that were brought from there before Chemosh, the Moabite main deity. Also the display of Saul's armor after his death in the Philistine temple of Ashtart in 2 Samuel 31, and the presentation of Goliath's sword in the sanctuary of Nob, 1 Samuel 21, are biblical examples for this idea that we bring spoils of war to the temple. And on the other hand, the return of the ark to Kiryat Yearim, if one considers this the original ending, or the return, bringing back the ark to Jerusalem, is considered to be an example of a report on the return of cult vessels that is a genre that is abundantly present in ancient Near Eastern chronicles. I will come back to this genre later on. And these references certainly give a certain cultural and religious background for the story of the ark narrative, but in my opinion these references are too unspecific. The evidence reaches from the second to the first millennium and covers Mesopotamia and its neighboring regions, an enormous geographical framework. So in a methodological perspective, I would regard those sources as meaningful references for our biblical text and for the authors and also for the redactors, which have either a factual or temporal connection to either the southern Levant or to Israel and Judah itself. And those would reflect the, let's say, the experienceable reality of the scribes or of the recipients of the texts. And as you can imagine, such sources do exist and are connected with the custom of the deportation of Celt statues, which I do understand as sort of foil for the taking of the ark by the Philistines and wandering through Philistine territory. And I will elaborate on this in the following. Because of the symbolic and religious importance of cult statues in ancient Mesopotamia, these images were targeted on numerous occasions by invading forces as part of the conquest of a foreign policy. In the case of the Assyrians, triumphant kings would sometimes list cult statues from a newly conquered city for a group as spoils of war, alongside members of the royal families, its subjects, and their precious goods. And such acts of divine deportation are sometimes called in literature god-napping, a term that was first coined by Alistair Livingston in an article from 1997. So god-napping refers in his view to the forcible removal of cult statues by invading forces. This is attested in ancient Mesopotamia from the Eastern Lhasa period at the start of the 2nd millennium BCE until the 6th century under the reign of Cyrus the Great. And historically, the deportation of the divine images more often than not was well advertised component in the punitive deportation of submissive rulers, ruling families, and population groups. And the knowledge that Assyrians deported the divine images of defeated enemy is as old as Assyriology itself. One of the first lengthy Akkadian inscriptions to be deciphered in 1850 by Henry Rawlinson, so the black obelisk of Salmanassar III, contains 3 instances of this practice. And the visual representations of this practice of god-napping, stealing or deporting cult statues, appeared the year before 1849 in Layard's publication of the findings from Nineveh. And several studies have thought to understand this phenomenon within the framework of Assyrian imperialism and political control and demoralizing of the defeated people, analyzing the correlation of the god and their images as well as their forceful deportations. And because cult statues were indeed considered as manifestations of gods, god-nabbing was a very powerful tool for asserting hegemony, demonstrating power over the powerless people, represented in the deportation of its seemingly powerless deity, God, and for demoralizing subjugated peoples who were thereby deprived of their gods and divine protection. An important research along this line, you can find this here, has been done in the last couple of years. Interestingly, attestations of god-nabbing, the stealing, deporting of cult statues, are only numerous in Assyrian sources, especially during the Neo-Assyrian period. There are 56 epigraphical and iconographical evidences, attestations of god-nabbing by Assyrians, found primarily in the royal Assyrian inscriptions, with a few cases recorded in the chronicles, royal correspondence, and palace reliefs. So the practice is attested in the Assyrian royal inscriptions, begin with Tiglath-Pileser I in the late Middle Assyrian period and continue through the reign of Ashurbanipal. The evidence, and this is important, the evidence is becomes very frequent for the Assyrian kings in the 8th century and the 7th century. So there we have the most attestations of this practice. We have 7 attestations of Tiglath-Pileser III, 4 under Sargon II, 10 under Sennacherib, 5 under Esarhaddon, and 4 under Ashurbanipal. And it is amongst these sources from the 8th and 7th century that for the first time this custom of god-nabbing, deporting the gods, is also documented for our region, for the southern Levant, and in peculiar for Samaria. The Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions of the second half of the 8th century testify to a regular practice of god-nabbing as documented for the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, or Ashdod. And with regard to the capital of the northern kingdom, Samaria, which was besieged and eventually conquered in 722-720, the summary inscription of the Nimrud prism reads as following: the inhabitants of Samarine, a lot of people together with their chariots and the gods in whom they trusted, as spoil I counted. This is the text from a Nimrud prison attributed to Sargon II. So the abducted deities, the gods mentioned here of Samaria, appear as usual within a list of spoils of war. He deported the people, the chariots, but also the gods as spoils of war. Then it's very interesting is this phrase, the gods in whom they trusted, which is also known from other inscriptions, where this phrase is designated to Assyria's own deities, so in the gods in we trusted in. This points for me to the fact that the Assyrians would have considered the non-Assyrian cult images as gods in their own right. So there's no reason to believe that the Assyrians considered non-native gods to be false idols, as we often have this in the biblical text. They are gods. They're not as powerful, of course, as the Assyrian gods, but they are still cult statues. They're still representations of this god or of this deity. This would mean that deported cult statues were largely treated with respect, depicted in the reliefs of Tiglath-Pileser III as being carried away intact by the Assyrian soldiers and even placed in the temples or given to Ashur. The first depiction you can see here is very famous, is this depiction of cult statues from Ashkelon. And the second is also the famous relief from the central palace of Nimrud. So this deportation is usually interpreted as the deportation of gods from Gaza after successful conquest of the city in 732 by Tiglath-Pileser III. But there are also good arguments and put forward by Angelika Berliung that this relief might point to a North Syrian city, maybe even to Apat or Unki. The last case of this visualization of deporting gods from the 8th and 7th century would be this one, or I should say a possible visualization. Christoph Uehlinger suggested that the relief that you can see here from Sargon's palace in Dur-Sharrukin visualizes the conquest of Samaria, described in the above-mentioned prism, as well as the removal of the statues of the gods from Samaria. And Uehlinger deduces this from the stereotypical arm posture in the other relief, like carrying some tablets where they put on the god statues, and he's basically connecting this with the relief you already know. On the statues were standing possibly the god statues. But as you can also see, this fragment is on this wall relief is very, very fragmentary, and due to these uncertainties one should not base any further conclusions on this evidence, even though it would represent a nice optimum case underlining the inscriptional testimony of gods deporting gods from Samaria. So, but the fact as such, what I wanted to show, the practice of deportation of cult statues of gods in the southern Levant is historically and religious historically well documented, but is shown sources, and there are also additional some more sources I didn't show you now, but these examples I think are enough. So we could move on to the third part of the paper. How would this now interact with the ark narrative in 1 Samuel 4-6? In my view, also my idea is that several features of the text feature elements of this idea of God napping. First of all, to begin with, the ark itself does represent Adonai, Yahweh, and can be understood as a cult statue that is deported after a lost battle by the opposing force. God's presence in or on the ark becomes quite obvious if one reads, for example, this text, the opening of the section 1 Samuel 4:3, as bringing the ark to the battle would mean that he may, Adonai, come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. And as acting object, Adonai is then also clearly mentioned in the context of 1 Samuel 5 and 7. This, you remember this travel narrative. Adonai, and not the ark, is the one that afflicts, that beats, the people of Ashdod, Gad, and Ekron, and Beth-Shemesh with deadly diseases. Julius Wellhausen even wrote that within this narrative, and compared with the other mentioning of the ark, it's heavily implying that God is active on the or with the ark here, just in this section of the text. Second parallel, comparable feature, the entire narrative setup already plays on the background of God napping practice, because the cult statue, the ark, is taken by the Philistines, which is alluded to in the name given at the end of 1 Samuel 4, Ikabod, where's the Kabod Adonai, God is gone. So in the following travel narrative sketches that such a picture as if Adonai was a prisoner of war on exhibition, just traveling from or being brought from location to location. However, in this narrative, and this is the theological point of the narrative, I would say, the purpose of God napping, that is demonstrating power of the victorious nation, is turned into the opposite. The victorious nation does not triumph over the population of Israel, over the Israelites, but the entire Philistine population suffers the blows of the supposedly powerless Israelite deity Adonai, and is repeatedly made clear by the comparative fates of the peoples of Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. They all suffer from the diseases, they all die in the cities, or most of the people die in the cities. A third remark on the text in 1 Samuel 5 I do have. In this context, one part of the narrative does not fit the overall narrative arc. There is a sort of fight between the god Dagon and Adonai in the temple of Ashdod, which you can see here. The text, it's 1 Samuel 5. The statue falls down on his face. That is in my view, and we have even iconographical references for this. It operates the gesture of proskynesis before the deity of Adonai, before the god of Adonai, and the Dagon statue after this is even destroyed in the second night, also by Adonai. So I regard this as within the arc narrative as a secondary redactional addition to the text, as it introduces, I would say, a different and later tradition historical perspective. While in the original perspective, the ark Adonai defeats the people of the Philistine cities, and the statues are not destroyed during the conquest. What we can make up from the god-napping practice in the Assyrian sources. As far as I know, there are only 2 instances by Ashurbanipal and Asarhaddon where actually cult statues are destroyed. Normally they are deported but not destroyed. And think also of the phrase, the God in whom they or we trusted, so there is a kind of respect. This is mirrored in the arc narrative. But there's no sense of destructing other cult statues. This is the point of this insertion, I think. Here in this episode in the Dagon temple brings up the confrontation of their respective gods. The gods are fighting against each other, a confrontation between Adonai and the god of the Philistines, which brings up a certain Deuteronomistic tone, I think, and one might also think here about iconoclasm to the whole story, which is not part of the original story, I would say. And that this part is secondary becomes also clear from a literary historical perspective, as the respective verses you can see here are not well connected with its context. You just can simply take it out and you have the whole original story. They bring the ark to the temple, and the next day they realize that the people in Ashdod are having diseases and are dead. Then they make the next decision. A fourth point. The god-napping background is also present with the Wiederaufnahme of the ark narrative in 2 Samuel 6, where the ark is finally transferred to Jerusalem. David takes the lead in a solemn procession that finally brings the ark narrative to Jerusalem. Burnt offerings and blessings for the people rounds up the story here in verse 17, 18 and 19. As you can hear from this, just one verse I put here. The text corresponds in a fair number of details to the imaginative world of the ancient Near Eastern royal ideology. This was already pointed out by the book I showed you earlier by Robert and Miller, especially to the practice of consecration of sanctuaries or the royal residence documented in Neo-Assyrian texts, in which the statues of the gods play a key role. So the genre of returning of cult statues or cult vessels is the counterpart, I think, of the god-napping practice. The closest parallels we can find in the cultic inauguration of a new capital in Neo-Assyrian period. Sargon II invites to this inauguration of Ashur. He invites the gods of Ashur and the other main deities to visit Dur Sharukin, the modern Khorsabad, and honors them with processions, sacrifices, and feasts like in 2 Samuel 6. Again, this already had been shown for 2 Samuel 6 by Robert and Miller. I'm just repeating the arguments. But they are also the same, in a similar way, these inaugurations of Nineveh reported by Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. Also, this is how the capital, how the residence is inaugurated, with the feasts and bringing back the cult statues. This would mean for the narrative that bringing back the ark to Jerusalem, this somehow inaugurates Jerusalem as the capital or as the main cultic center for the Israelite cult. And the fifth and last point in this comparison would be the God-napping theme of the narratives is emphasized, I think, by a literary bracket in 2 Samuel 5. And this bracket has not been gotten much attention before, as 2 Samuel 5 is usually seen as the ending of the so-called ascension narrative of David and not be part of the ark narrative. But anyway, we can look here at the text. It's right before the transfer of the ark to Jerusalem is mentioned that David and his men carried away the idols of the Philistines, which the latter had lost after their lost battles against David. And this again mirrors the starting point, the position in 1 Samuel 4, and turns it into the opposite. The prospective king of Jerusalem, David, manages to finally defeat the prime enemy. And by this I mean the enemy that was just introduced at the beginning of the book. Samuel was introduced in 1 Samuel 4 within the ark narrative. That's the first time we hear about the Philistines within the book of Samuel being the prime enemies of Israel. Now David defeats the enemy. Whereas the Philistines took, practicing the God-napping, took the ark but didn't manage to hold it. It is now David that defeated the Philistines and succeeded in his God-napping of the Philistine idols. When in the following, the God-napping proves David as the victorious ruler and Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 6, as Israel's legitimate cultic place. There we have an interesting text historical case. The Masoretic text uses here the disrespectful term idols, which I mentioned here in my argumentation. But the Septuagint and the Latina and also the parallels in Chronicles speak of gods here. David does not take the idols but the gods. And I would think basically because of the same reasons what I said about 1 Samuel 5, this Dagon fight between Dagon and Adonai, that the parallels in Chronicles, Septuagint and Latina, they represent the original version because they are speaking in a more neutral way about gods. They are taking the gods from the Philistines. It's only in a later period that the Masoretic text makes from the gods this well-known picture of the idols, which we have in other biblical texts, but in the ark narrative, I think this would be a totally new layer. They are not speaking about idols. There's a certain common ground on God statues. I come to my conclusions. I have several and preliminary conclusions here. The first would be, it could be demonstrated, I think, that the custom of God-napping provides a cultural, historical, and also a religious, political background, a narrative foil for the biblical ark narrative. As the custom of God-napping was maintained also in the southern Levant, especially by the Assyrian kings from the 8th century, 7th century, this would provide for me a hermeneutical framework for placing that narrative in this very historical context. And second, talking about the aim or the objectives this narrative follows, what does it aim at, the narrative? I have 3 major points here. First, it underlines Adonai's power as a national god. Not even the powerful imperial strategies of the Assyrians managed to break Adonai's power, as he is even brought back to homeland by the representatives of the formerly victorious nations that we have in 1 Samuel 6. The Philistines bringing back the ark to the homeland of Judah. Second, with the return of Israel's cultic statue, the ark, Jerusalem is qualified as the new and legitimate place of worship within Israel. By transferring the ark from an important sanctuary in the north, Shiloh, this is the starting of the narrative, to Jerusalem, this might manifest the claim of the Judahite city, Jerusalem, to create a new center of Yahwistic belief, Yahwistic cult. And this, I place this in the framework of the 8th and 7th century, a new center of Yahwistic belief after the destruction or downfall of the northern kingdom, meaning after 722. And according to the ark narrative, Jerusalem was chosen by God himself and is qualified by its presence on the ark inside the tent where it was placed by David. The ark narrative is to be understood as a reflex on theology of Zion, Zion's theology, which according, for example, to Otto Markel and others, is fundamentally conceivable following the unexpected withdrawal of Sennacherib from Jerusalem in 701 BCE. The writers are therefore probably most likely to be found at the court of Hizkiyahu or Josiah. But since the description of the statues of the gods, and now I'm bringing another argument, does not bear any iconoclastic trait, the first possibility, placing it somewhere under the reign of Hizkiah, could probably the more probable one. And the last point, the narrative very clearly criticizes the Assyrian praxis of God-nabbing, which is apparent, and by this criticizes the Assyrians, which is apparent from the use of a custom predominantly connected with the Assyrian imperialism. But by this, it does not speak about the Assyrians, it does also criticize the Philistines, or the Philistines, which function as a foil for this Assyrian practice. And we do not have any specific information about the Philistines within the ark narrative. They are mentioning the Philistine Pentapolis, so that's it. There could be some historical ground, but not specific. So I think this idea of Philistines being a foil for Assyrians could be a good, plausible explanation. On the background of this critique and polemics, and ultimately this west-east aspect of the overall narrative coming from Ashdod to Jerusalem, could be seen in Philistia's historical role after Sennacherib's campaign to Philistia and Judah in 700 BCE. Sennacherib crushed the rebellions in Ekron and Ashkelon and reinstated the original and loyal king party after the revolt. It seems that the Assyrians preserved the independence of Philistines to some degree as a buffer zone between Assyria and Egypt. And in the aftermath, the Assyrian king seems, and this is the important point, seems to have transferred territory from Judah, maybe the Shephelah, we heard this yesterday, transferred territory from Judah to the Philistine cities, loyal to Ashur. So the Philistines would then appear from a Judean perspective as representatives or as opportunists or as supporters of the Assyrians. And when the ark narrative, the practice of God-nabbing, is de facto declared ineffective, Adonai returns, Adonai is even brought back by the formerly victorious nation, then it rejects both Philistines and Assyrians' claim on Judean territory. So there would be several other subsequent questions related to these observations, especially related to the literary historical context of the ark narrative and its integration into the narratives in the first book of Samuel, in the Saul narrative and Samuel's narrative, but also in the David narrative of ascension. So, but I will rest my case here and leave these questions for discussion, and I thank you very much for the attention.